Welcome to the Monster Romance Study. Today, I'm sharing with you an interview I had with the popular monster romance author Lillian Lark in the fall of 2022. Lillian is the author to many popular monster romance novels like Deceived by the Gargoyles, Stalked by the Kraken, Entranced by the Basilisks, Ensnared by the Werewolf, and Found by the Lake Monster. As such, Lillian's characters were mentioned 23 times in the study for most recent monster attractions. So, without further ado, here is my interview with Lillian Lark. Would you describe that, perhaps not a focus, but that your monsters are titillating?
Sure, yeah, like there is undoubtedly like some people who pick up my books because another person's like, it's got this in it.
Right.
And they'll be like, it's got gargoyles or it's got tentacles.
Right.
But like when I focus on making them, I don't really focus on the fact that, like so taboo to have tentacles down there.
Oh,
Most
no.
I'm not thinking about it. Like I'm not thinking about it in those terms. And like, to be fair, it could just be that I'm thinking, like, lots of people will tag me in TikToks and be like when it's got like a squid on it, and they're just like, Lillian Lark. I'm like, okay, so
you have like, one book. I'm pretty certain that's just the Kraken.
I never considered like those as like real tentacles, like in my brain,
right?
Like in my brain. They're just like fun sex toys. They're not like the tentacles themselves.
Right.
Where that would be a little like they don't act like tentacles. They don't like function like when he's stuffing her full to the brim. It's like, it's not the same thing as maybe it's an octopus trying to get into a bottle.
Oh, like, of course not. Oh, no. Of course. Yeah, of course. No. That would be an added layer of horror.
That's lots of tagging, right?
Right. Well, I think that fantasy perhaps is a great place to kind of play with taboo without fully embracing like what you're saying, which is like going into like, actual suckers or where things can get really off course fast.
Like I do respect everyone who tags me in those, but sometimes like I don't think about those tentacles in that way.
Right. I guess what is then your relationship to monstrosity within romance, I'll just say?
So one of the questions that you sent is like, well, how do you define monstrosity? And it's like just anything other than human, because then they don't have to follow the same rules of believability when you're writing a human. Someone's just like, they wouldn't do that, or they can't do that. So it's anything out of that, but like specifically for like monster romance, everyone identifies that as like, well, they have to have like a separate form than a human. And some people don't consider like shifters even monster romance.
Which is so funny to me because they absolutely are. Absolutely.
Yeah, like because a lot of my characters will have a human form and then a non-human form.
Correct.
And so I still identify them as monster romances, but people who are like sticklers about it will just be like, no, like a monster romance is where they're a monster the whole time. And like
very limiting.
I can see that perspective. I like fully can see that perspective. I just don't follow rules, so I still call myself a monster romance writer.
That's so fascinating to me because so many monsters within popular culture are shifters, are hybrids, are actually what they're called. Like a werewolf, for example. A lot of werewolves shift from human to, werewolf. So they exhibit these two forms, and it's very common. So it's interesting to me that people would reject that because it's very common within.
And it could just be like what they're looking for.
Right.
Like
which is another thing.
The personal way that they identify something is like that way. And like, that's fine. That's within their thing. I'll still market it to like the people that I think want it and use those kind of definitions. So
absolutely. I'm reading through and kind of giving a glance at everybody's responses. And I've had a couple people even question about like, well, are vampires monsters? And I think that's really funny because it calls upon this idea of like, if something is human looking, can we even still deem it as a monster? And it does call upon a lot of questions about what is a monster? How do we define a monster? It's very hard. It's very liquid to define. It's constantly fluctuating.
I would definitely say that vampires were a gateway monster.
Absolutely. And that's what's so funny about the survey is, I have so many people who don't identify as monster romancers or monster fuckers. And I'm like, well, were you a fan of Twilight? Did you like Twilight? And they're like, yeah, but, and I'm like, that's a gateway.
He did not have a fun dick.
He didn't. That's true.
That could just be the way that people want to identify. It's like, oh, did he have a fun attribute?
Right.
I didn't think they bit in Twilight.
No. Stephanie Meyer, that's the whole thing. And that's a whole nother politics of monstrosity. And
plenty of other vampires, amazing vampire books out there.
Yes.
That were also gateways.
Absolutely. And of course, vampires are a great way to explore sexuality. And I know that you even explore sexuality in some of your books, especially Deceived by the Gargoyles, because it has a male, female protagonist or love interest, I would say. And I guess that kind of ties in nicely to the next question of like, if you find that your sexual orientation drives your understanding or your portrayal of, let's even just say, the way that you write romance.
I mean, probably, definitely, but I would say like not necessarily orientation, but definitely interest. Like sexual interest, like really define how I write monsters. And when I say like interest, I mean like kinks or like the things that turn you on. Like, and I don't necessarily think that goes super in line with orientation, but like kinks are definitely like a big thing with monster romance. And it's like there's a later question that's like, oh, like what about monsters are like, do you think help women explore this? It's like, oh, it's definitely helping in the fact that anyone can explore kinks in a way where it is devoid of trying to make it realistic, of people having to have this idea of someone actually being tied up. It can be like, oh, they're restrained by tentacles. It's the same. It's like it's stroking the same type of neurons in your brain and being like, is that something I like? And some people are just like, I didn't know that was something I liked.
And that happens quite often. A little oopsie kink awakening.
Because you've got like stretching, breathing, restraint, like all these things I think are analogous to like kinks that people experience or know they like even like biting, like
vor or blood, that is so tied into monstrosity as well, especially with like vampires.
Combining like pain and pleasure, like that's something that a lot of people, I think, before, I don't even like generalize it, but like definitely a few people were like, I don't think pain and pleasure can go hand in hand. Read a monster romance where somehow pain and pleasure did go in hand, and they're just like, oh, okay, I see where that is coming from. And maybe it's not something that even like strokes their neurons, but now they have that added empathy towards that. And seeing it as something that is possible.
So I think that you would be in agreement then that all monster romances have in some way some sort of fantastical element that elevates sexual desire in some form, whether it's tentacles or fangs or knots, etc. It has to do with the monstrous body and how it can push sexual desire.
I mean, and that could also, like, bringing it away from eroticism, it's just like, it's an extension of how people like look at other people's bodies, like having like a guy having nice hands.
Right.
Like when it's put together with a character that you like, you're like, you can look in the context of attraction towards these monstrous things. Like it doesn't necessarily have to just be titillating. Like maybe some of my characters wouldn't be into tentacles if they weren't put together with the character that they're with.
Right. I think I remember in Deceived by the Gargoyles, Grace, your protagonist, she is paired with gargoyles, but she has no idea. And so, it comes as a surprise to her when she figures that out. And so I think that's kind of what you're talking about right there, which is, I don't think that she would have ever assumed, first and foremost, to be open in a polyamorous relationship or to be in one with paranormal creatures. Are there any boundaries within monstrosity that you personally will not cross, such as specific attributes that you can't find appealing, whether it's physical or not physical?
I don't know if it happens as much anymore, but definitely at the beginning, it was like, oh, monster romance. And someone's just like, isn't that just bestiality?
Yes.
And it's just like, no, like,
right.
Like, I would say definitely a rule is, like in a line that I would not cross is like if you cannot identify that monster as a person anymore, if they don't have the ability to consent, if they don't have like those types of things that mark them as a sentient being who is like on board, of age, can communicate certain things that like relate to a personality, like that's where definitely that's the hard limit, is like, oh, are these monsters or is it bestiality? And it's like, no, these are monsters. These are people with personalities who are communicating and consenting in this situation.
Right. No, I've seen that argument a lot where people are trying to say that this is bestiality, and I'm like, no.
Like it's completely different. Like, are the tentacles in my book like just really fun sex toys in my brain, or actual tentacles? And like either way, it is a fantasy. It's different.
Yes.
Different, and they're attached to a person.
Right.
Like that, they're a part of a character who has a personality, who has this ability to consent and to communicate.
I think you hit the nail on the head with that, especially in emphasizing that this is fantasy. It doesn't quite cross over a lot of times into reality. A big part of my study that I've done previously was on configuring dark romance, as well as giving a platform to the readership and talking to them about their interpretations of the genre. And the biggest running theme throughout that genre, throughout dark romance, is this idea of escapism and fantasy. And I would say a big chunk, if not the majority of the readership, was like, of course I don't want this to happen to me in real life. Of course I don't view this as healthy, or of course I don't view this as etc. This is just fantasy. This just exists on page. And so I think that's especially also the case here. Obviously, the readership is not like, boy, howdy, I'm going to go out and find an octopus. That's just not how that works.
It's a different thing. Well, definitely with the tentacles, it's the idea of stretching. It's like, that's an actual kink.
Right.
Like, there are toys for that. And there's like, there are systems put in place. There's ways to do that.
Right.
In the kink sphere. You just maybe didn't know about it beforehand.
And I think it's a bit of infantilization as well, where, you have people talk about like, well, that's not realistic, about like say like Ruby Dixon, for example, where her aliens have dicks that are like a foot long, like they're like the size of baseball bats. And you're like, well, obviously that would never work ever in real life. Obviously we know this. Do you take the readership to be stupid? I think there's a fair amount of infantilization taking place when interacting with like fetish or kinks.
Yeah. And just Ruby Dixon, that it would be like, yes, there are attributes about her aliens that are meant to tantalize and titillate. But like the reason people go back to her books aren't because of the spurs. Like they go back because it's delivering on something else. And usually when people are like, well, that's not realistic, they're talking about these mates who are all in will sacrifice everything in their life for this opportunity to make their resonance, their chosen mate by their kids. They're talking about those types of things as not being realistic. It's like, yes, the baseball bat stuff is not realistic, but that's not really what I think people are focusing on when they're reading it. Those are added benefits. They're like, oh, these are fun things. Like when Katie Robert put like in Dragon's Bride, he has two. He's got two dicks. Yeah. And it's not necessarily that people who read it want that. It's just, it's a fun added benefit. This is like, that's hot. But like the story itself is separate. And like what people, I think, are actually reading. So
you said that you don't, when you write, you're not explicitly exploring taboo. It is just something that exists within the storyline, which I think is fascinating.
It usually doesn't have, like, my stories don't, I was going to say they don't always have that moment of the character being like, am I into this?
Right.
But some of them do, where they're like, hey, I have this thing. I'm this thing. And that means I have this equipment. Like, is this okay? Can we keep going?
Right.
And then the character has to be like, well, like, yeah, we can keep going. For some reason in my brain, when we talk about like exploring taboo, it's usually a lot more emphasis, having a plot point that has a lot more emphasis of being like, am I okay with this? Is this okay? Am I a bad person for wanting this or being okay with it? Like,
interesting.
To me, it's like that has a very particular plot point that is a lot longer than just being like, you have a knot in your penis. I can do that.
I think you bring up a great point. Yeah. I think you bring a great point of how taboo differentiates between a subject and the content, where you have, like you said, in most of your stories, there's not shock, there's not titillation of like, am I into this? You know, most of them are already aware of the paranormal, aware of, you know, how this world works. They're cool with it. But I wonder if there's a sense of taboo on our end, on the reader's end, or on the author's end of, you know, we are consuming and desiring something that we as humans are desiring something that is inhuman. And so I wonder if there's taboo, at least in that regard, instead of not just in content.
It's different for me because I write it. So like when I write my stories, like it's not something that's taboo. Like when I read some stories, it could just be like, and maybe it's because I've read so much over the years that I don't have that same sort of reaction.
Right.
Because
it's just you're so desensitized.
I'd never read a Kraken and be like, am I a bad person for wanting that in real life? To me, it's so devoid of reality. Well, like, because beforehand I was saying, like, the way you identify dark romance is like it's exploring this taboo subject. And so for me, in my definition of monster romance, does not fall under dark romance, because to me, dark romance, like, you feel you have to go through the whole roller coaster in your brain where, like, usually something dark happens between, like, in the couple, in the relationship. And you have to be like, it's either violent, it's something where you have been told your entire life, this is not okay.
Right.
And so when you read that and you realize, like, hey, there's some things about this that appeal to me. Like, does that make me a bad person? Like, I feel like that is a much more, like,
there's a split.
Like, that's why dark romance is in that taboo, because it could actually happen. And just because you like to read it, it does not mean you want it to actually happen without, like, safeguards and stuff like that. Like, that's like the fantasy fiction.
Right.
So that's why I don't really put monster romance in that same category a lot, because the majority of monster romances I read and write are, like, very cuddly, very cozy, this is their safe place, while, like, or like consent is like top tier, while there are, like, so to me that's like not in the same category as a dark romance where like you are dealing with things that in your brain, you know, that like you're not supposed to like, but maybe you do. Like I love reading Dubious Consent sometimes. Like I'm a fan. I've read a lot of books like that. Definitely like there are definitely monster romances that do that. So like I would identify like when I do my TikToks, like I always put like a big flashing thing, like this is monster, or this is the key that's like, oh, characters are going to do things that you don't like. And you have to like interpret those and figure out and do your own reflections about them. And with monster romance, it doesn't feel like the same because to me, it is very separate. It's like, do you want to get stretched out by a gargoyle dick? It's like, yeah. Like, is that bad? Is that bad?
Do you remember offhand your first monster romance book that you ever read that was perhaps something that opened your eyes to this about like this exists?
Okay, so like I'm a huge sci-fi romance reader.
Sure.
Like before this, like I read like all the things, like all the parts, like tentacles, whatever, in sci-fi romance because like I just wasn't finding it, and paranormal romance I didn't find it. They probably existed. I just didn't find it. So when I was writing it, I was mostly pulling from like my love of sci-fi romance. It's like Susan Trombley was like, she's got like the Kraken's mate, and like her aliens look like aliens, you know, like
proper
lion faces and lizard faces and stuff like that, where like maybe they still have abs, which is always the funny part, that they still have abs, but it's beside the point.
There's something that always comes back to humanoid. That's some sort of human desire. Sometimes, like not always.
She started like the Scorpion's mate was probably like the first where it was like, okay, so this is a romance. He does not look like a guy. Like he's bipedal, but he's got all exoskeleton.
Right.
And he feeds her with his dick. Like it's very inhuman. I don't even think they can kiss. So that was definitely like the start, but like that is sci-fi romance. And maybe readers don't know much about this part of it, but like it used to be very difficult to write monster romance because Amazon would be like bestiality. And so a lot of them did sci-fi romance because it's aliens, and like aliens are different.
It was a nice loophole.
And I think, and so like even now there are groups of like in publishing authors being like, just wait, like they're gonna crack down on you for putting tentacles and knots and stuff like that in your books. And like that could very well happen because we don't control who sells art. Like we control where we can sell. But like Amazon is the biggest market for me anyway. I've started like publishing on like Barnes Noble and stuff like that. But that takes a lot more time to gain traction because Amazon is just so big.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's so frustrating because I know that Amazon, they are the biggest for, it's almost publicity because they take so much money of like funds. But as an author or as a publisher, if you don't sell on Amazon, you are missing out on probably one of the most biggest search engines for books.
And it does happen where, so like way back when, like a lot of authors who would be writing werewolf that knotted, or like were lycanthrope, or that had lycanthropy or something, where they were actually in their werewolf form, shifting, like they would get banned off Amazon.
Right.
And so like there was a lot of fear around that. I didn't know about it when I put tentacles in my book and just published it, and it ends up being what people want most from me. So nah. Like I know
suddenly
now,
that was your thing.
Yeah, like I know now, and so there's always the worry in the back of your head being like,
yeah.
But like I do think that people have become like, probably because of sci-fi romance, people became so much more okay with this idea of having tentacles or whatever, and in a romance. and then that was the gateway drug to being okay with it in paranormal romance, or like that people are not as like surprised to see it there.
Right. Are there any particular monster movies that speak to you, that like excite you, or, you know, perhaps that are influencing you?
In the very beginning, it's like, oh, like vampires were very influential.
Yeah.
Because like the idea of like also like Underworld, and
of course,
werewolves in there, and like I was always super into that kind of media. I really liked it. I don't necessarily delve into it all the time to be like, oh, well, like Dracula had brides, you know, like
he did. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. For better or worse, Twilight was influential, you know.
Yeah.
And Rice, you know, vampires are very, very, I don't think they'll ever go out.
Twilight got a lot of people reading who didn't read. So
yeah, absolutely.
It had an impact.
And I think the last question I'll ask is, who are some of the authors right now that are producing some of the best monster romances, in your opinion, and why?
Like, it's hard because there are so many.
Yes.
And like, if I miss them, I don't want them so bad. Like if I miss you, it's because my brain does not function all the time. But like, best monster romance, like Sam This Puss and This Puss, like hit #1 in the Amazon stores. Like, huge deal. Yeah. And like Cleo Evans has an entire, like, multiple series, just exploring different aspects of like different relationship dynamics and monsters at the same time. And like me, of course.
Right. But I can't forget about the biggest name.
And like Katie Robert made like the really cool clinch cover Cool Again.
Right. So, yes. I love that. I love that the bodice rippers are coming back, but with like a monster romance twist. It's amazing.
I think it's fantastic. Again, if I forget to name anyone, it's not because I don't love their work.
Oh no,
because
there are just a plethora.
But why do I think they're the best? And it goes back to like having those stories that people want to read, that people identify with, the characters that people identify with. And that's not like that's why I think they're the best. It's not necessarily because of the monster parts or anything like that. They just, Ruby Dixon. Oh my God, I didn't say Ruby Dixon. But like like people go back to these books and they love them so much. It's not because of the stretching. Well, maybe it is because of reading. Who knows? But it's because they speak to them on some level that like, that they have. It's a part of the romance. They dig the found family trope. They dig they can see themselves in that main character as they go through their character arc. It Morning Glory Milking Farm, that burnt out millennial mindset.
Right.
Like that was why I picked it up. I was like, oh, and they're a Minotaur. Yes, with 24 ounces. I will enjoy reading this a lot. But the reason I picked it up was like, burnt out person starting a different career. I can definitely relate.
I absolutely. Thank you, Lillian. I want to just wrap this up really quickly, just because I only have a minute, less than 2 minutes left. And I don't want it to cut off and then you just be like, well, that was it. Thank you, Lillian, so much for participating in this and carving out some time for this silly little interview. I really do appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun speaking with you, and it has been very helpful, actually.
Thank you for the invite. It's been super fun and interesting to go through these and like reflect on them,
Oh, absolutely.
I just sit down and work. I don't necessarily always think things through. I just be like, my brain really likes that. Let's write that.
And so you just kind of go with it. And so I feel like it's fun to have other people be like, what do you mean by that? And kind of look into that further, which is why I'm here. And so I'm very excited to see where this data leads. So again, thank you, Lillian. I will wrap this up. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And we'll be in touch.